Good morning, everybody. I'm Paul Welburn, and this is Faith Baptist Church Sunday School, and it is Sunday morning, and it's a beautiful day. It's going to be wonderful this week. Warm, 90s, North Carolina. But we're going to be continuing our study in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. And if you remember, Jesus had been in the temple. He'd been talking to the disciples about the end of time, really. The disciples said, "Tell us what it's going to be like, what's going to happen." They'd been marveling at the temple, how beautiful it was. And Jesus started off in Matthew 24, really the whole chapter. But he started off in the Matthew 24 by saying the temple is going to be destroyed. And he was talking about in 70 AD, which was going to be 30, 40 some years later, from that time point where they were, the Romans would just basically take apart the temple, take all the things that were in it and destroy it. Jesus right now is up on a hillside talking to the disciples and the Mount of Olives, and this is why it's called the Olivet Discourse. He goes on to tell the disciples what's going to happen during the tribulation and then the second coming, and we talked about this last week. A lot of people get the rapture and the second coming confused. The rapture, just kind of a quick recap, is we don't know when it's going to happen. We'll look at this in this passage, but we have some clues. But the rapture will happen suddenly. There's going to be 7 years of tribulation, and God's going to step back. And then his second coming is happening at the end of the tribulation. Basically, the second advent, if you want to use more liturgical language. The first advent was Christmas. The second advent is whenever Jesus returns to earth at the end of the tribulation. Now, we don't know the start of the tribulation when it's going to happen, but you can start the clock, and 7 years, you'll know whenever Jesus will return. So people are going to accept Christ during the tribulation. There's still going to be free will where people can choose to follow Christ, even though they've denied him up until that point and have been left behind. And so you're going to have believers there during the tribulation welcoming Christ. And that's mentioned in this passage, not necessarily the passage here that we look at, but we've looked at that passage where it's talked about the elect. Matthew 24, verses 32 through 33, Jesus goes on to talk to them. And so he goes back to talk about prior to the tribulation, prior to the rapture, these are the things to look for. Now, there's some theologians that do think Jesus is talking about just prior to his second advent, his second returning to earth, but most theologians feel like this is him talking about the rapture and then the tribulation, but just before the rapture. So Matthew 24, verses 32 through 33. Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you'll know summer is near. In the same way, when you all see these things, recognize that he is near at the door. I have actually two I've always called them fig bushes, but they are large. They almost look like small trees, but large shrubs, small trees. But it takes a little bit, and you look at their multiple trees have leafed out, and it takes them a while. But when they do, it's fast. And but their branches are kind of long and spindly, and you think, okay, has it died? The first. I didn't know if it survived the first winter whenever I planted one my first time, 30 some years ago. So figs are interesting, and Jesus uses that as whenever you see the leaves come out, know that the Lord is near. Now, it's not every year we look at fig shrubs and say, Jesus is near, but he's giving an example that there's going to be lots of signs that are coming up to his return for us, and then, of course, his return to earth 7 years later. Again, it's easy to get confused with this. Matthew 24, verses 34 through 35. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. People, again, have gotten confused about this passage because he's talking to disciples, and they're not alive now. I mean, this has been 2,000 plus years ago. Obviously, none are alive. So what did he mean by that? And theologians, again, think that he's referencing the destruction of the temple. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody and you've mentioned several points, and at the end of the conversation, you do kind of a recap? That's kind of what Jesus is doing here. He's covered multiple things: the destruction of the temple, the rapture, his second advent. And so he's recapping some of these things that he's discussed. So the temple is going to be destroyed in about 40 years. Some of you are going to be alive. Some of you will not. Some of the generation will still be here whenever the Romans come in and ransack this place. Other theologians feel like Jesus is also making a reference to there's going to be believers that whenever the rapture happens, they'll be raptured up. So a lot of theologians, though, believe that he's referencing the destruction of the temple that he'd just been talking about earlier. Remember, in the Bible, we tend to look at verses and we take them verse by verse and we forget some of the previous verses. So don't forget, remember context, what he's talking about. And again, think about how you have discussions with people, what it's like. It's very similar. Matthew 24, verses 36 through 41, and we'll wrap it up here. Now, concerning the day and the hour, nobody knows. During the early 1900s, I'm sure people felt like Christ was the rapture was going to be soon because of World War and pandemic. Now we're having those same feelings. It is interesting to see how there is more of as we continue on through time, people are growing further and further away from believing in Jesus and believing in a God at all. Back in the early 1900s, you still had a majority population of people that believed, and now it's getting more and more where people are just whatever feels good, very feelings based, and a lot of like what it was in the days of Noah. If you look at this, verse 37, as in the days of Noah were, so is the coming of man, the Son of Man will be. So basically, I mangled that sentence, but basically you see what he's saying. Just like it was back in Noah's day will be just like it will be before the rapture. People are just, they don't care. They just do whatever. And that's the way they were back in Noah's time. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah boarded the ark. They did not know until the flood came and swept them away. This way the Son of Man will be. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding grain, one hand at the mill, the other taken and one left. And that is where Jesus really gets into that, and where we base, and there's multiple rapture passages in the Bible, but we think about how a believer working with a non-believer, and that believer being raptured and taken away to heaven, and the non-believer left behind. We don't know if it's going to be just instantaneous. We believe so, in the twinkling of an eye, which is just a quick flash, that twinkle. But you think about rapture, somebody going whoop and going up, but it could just be a quick disappearance. I've referenced in other messages how people have thought about how, certain science fiction movies and how half the population disappears at the snap of a finger of this great God, little God, or, great leader or whatever. And so the population's been conditioned that whenever that does happen, it will fit right into some of these science fiction movies. I love science fiction. I love, to me, being in the world but not of the world, realize that there's a lot of things that are conditioning people. You can be entertained, but realize the source of a lot of these things is basically conditioning of people. So whenever the rapture does happen, they may look at this and think it's basically a science fiction movie coming true, and not really still believe in the true God. So it's interesting seeing now. I don't want to be a date setter, but it, again, does seem like we're getting closer and closer, and we are as time progresses. But people are very unfeeling as far as towards God, just neutral, blah, but very, very self-centered, thinking about themselves. And the way it looks now, we could be close. Go out and look at a fig tree, fig bush, fig shrub. Anytime you look at figs, think about this passage. Have a fig Newton, think about this passage. Anyway, hope you have a great week ahead, and we will continue on. We have a few more passages here in Matthew before we end this study. Thanks, everybody.